Today we'll be talking about Unit 2 review. I'm going to be choosing some questions to do from your review sheet. Let's start with the first one. You're supposed to complete the table starting with the quadratic function. You have to state the vertex, domain, range, and to decide whether it's wider, narrower, or the same width as the parent function. Now, the parent function of quadratic functions is y equals to x squared. I'm going to be doing this one and this one. So let's start with the vertex. To decide what the vertex is, you have to ask yourself, how is this new graph moving in comparison to the parent function? From this, you can see it's shifting 4 units to the right, so the x is going to be 4, and 3 units up, so the vertex is going to be 4, 3. As for this one, it's moving or shifting 6 units to the left and 1 down, so it's going to be -6, -1. So you decide what the vertex is from HK, like how is it shifting, right, left, or up and down to decide the x and y of the vertex. Now the domain and range of those two. A quadratic function usually looks like this, if it's a regular one, and if it's a reflected, it looks like this. So, as you can see, it's going to be extending from both sides, left and right. So the domain is going to be -infinity to infinity, no matter what the equation of the quadratic function is, since it extends from both directions, on and on. Now the range, if it's like a regular quadratic, is going to start from the y of the vertex all the way up to infinity, or it's going to start from the y vertex of the vertex all the way down to -infinity. And you decide that by looking at the equation. If it is a positive one, then it's going to go up. If it's a negative one, then it's reflected and going down. So the domain for this one is going to be from the vertex, which is 3, all the way to infinity. Now the vertex of this one is going to be, since it's negative, is going to be from -infinity to the y of the vertex, which is -1. So it's going to be from -infinity to -1. This is how you decide what the domain and range is for quadratic functions. Now to decide whether it's wider, narrower, or the same width as the parent function, you look by what number it's being multiplied. Now it's multiplied by a number greater than 2, then it's going to go narrower, since it's going to be vertically stretched. Now if it's multiplied by like 1, so it's going to be the same. Remember, the negative tells you whether it's reflected or not. So basically you look at the number that's being multiplied by. Here there's no number, so it's the same width. Here it's 2, so it's going to be vertically stretched and narrower. Here it's 1, so it's going to be the same. This one over here is multiplied by a number less than 1, which is the quarter, so it's going to be wider, since it's going to be vertically compressed. Now this is what quadratic function is about. Now let's move on to square root functions. A square root function usually starts from a point and goes this way if it's regular, or starts from a point and goes this way if it's reflected. So let's say this is the negative and this is the positive. I'm going to be doing this one and this one. It's basically the same idea when it comes to the starting point, just like the idea of doing the vertex. So decide how it's shifting. It's shifting 6 to the right and 3 down, so it's going to be 6, -3. As for this one, it's going to go 2 to the left and 9 up, so -2, 9. This is how you decide what the point, the end point, or you can say the starting point of your square root function. Now the domain and range. As you can see, it's always starting from a point and going to a right. So it's going to be moving to +infinity all the time, starting from the x of the end point, since domain has to do with x. So in this case, it's going to be 6 to infinity, since the x of the end point is 6, and here the x of the end point is -2, so it's going to be -2 to +infinity. So as you can see, since it's always going to the right, so it's always going towards +infinity. Now the range. As you can see, this is starting from the y of the endpoint and going up. And this is from the y of the endpoint and going down. So every time it's a positive 1, it's a regular 1. So it's going from the y all the way to +infinity. this is what the range is. So in this case, it's going to be -3 to plus infinity. Now this one, since it's negative, so it's reflected going from the y of the endpoint all the way down to -infinity. So the range is going to be -infinity to 9. Remember, you always start from the lowest number. Now as for whether it's taller, flatter, or the same, taller means it's going to be vertically stretched, so it's the same as narrower. Flatter is the same thing as vertically compressed or vertically shrink. It's the same as wider. So taller and narrower go together, and flatter and wider go together. So this is going to be a W. Now, to decide whether it's taller or flatter, you look at the number that you're multiplying with. So since you're multiplying by a number that's less than 1, it's going to go flatter and wider. So this is going to be an F. Now, since here you're multiplying by a number greater than 1, remember you don't look at the negative. The negative means it's reflected. So you look at the 3 since it's greater than 1, so it's going to go taller or narrower or vertically stretched. So it's going to be taller. Now let's move on to absolute value function. An absolute value function, if you ever graph it, it's going to be a V shape. So basically, it's so similar to the quadratic function, the same idea applies over and over again, since this is going to be shifted 5 to the left and 4 down, so the vertex is going to be -5 and 4. I'll be doing this one, and let's do a positive one. Let's do this one. Now, for this one's going to be -5 and 8, since it's moving 5 to the left and 8 up. The domain, since it looks like a U, mostly like a U, so it's going to be stretching from left to right. So the domain is always going to be -infinity to infinity, no matter what, just like quadratic function. Now for the range, it depends. Is it opening up? If it's a +1, it's going to be opening up, starting with the vertex and going up to plus infinity. If it's going to be reflected because it's a negative function, then it's going to be starting from the y of the vertex down to -infinity. Now, since this is a negative, so it's this case, it's being reflected across the x-axis. So the range is going to be -infinity to the y of the vertex, which is 4. Now this one, it's plus, so it's going to be a regular absolute value function. So the range is going to be from the y of the vertex up. So it's going to be 8 to infinity. Now to decide whether it's wider, narrower, or the same, you look by what number it's being multiplied. Here, basically, it's not multiplied by anything. It's basically 1. So it's going to be the same width. This one, however, is being multiplied by a number less than 1. So it's going to be a shrink situation. So it's going to be wider. So this is how you decide what the vertex, domain, and range, and whether it's wider, narrower for those 3 functions. Now let's move on to the next page. Now you should be able to do this one, sketching the parent function, which is x squared, and here is basically sketching the square root function, which is radical x. I'm gonna skip this part, and if you want to see it, you can look at the answer key. I'm gonna be choosing from this part. I'm gonna only be doing this and this. So let's start with the quadratic function, and you're supposed to be writing an equation of quadratic function with vertex 6 and 2. So vertex 6 and 2, it means it's going to be moving 6 to the right, so inside the parentheses is going to be x minus 6. It's going to be moving 2 up, so it's going to be plus 2. Since this is a quadratic, so it's going to be a square. So x minus 6 squared plus 2, this is basically the basic form. You can be multiplying by half. You can be multiplying by a number that's 2. You can put -half or -2. It doesn't matter as long as the vertex or whatever is inside is -6 and 2. So on the outside, you can have whatever you want, positive, negative, or any number. Now, writing an equation for a quadratic function whose range is -infinity to -1. Now, by looking at the range, it's a range of a flipped or a reflected quadratic function, so there should be a negative. And since it's a -1 over here, so outside the parentheses, it's going to be -1. So as long as you have a negative and a -1 on the outside, it doesn't matter what would be on the inside. So you can just put -x squared or you can give me another example like negative x minus 2 or x plus 2 squared minus 1. So as long as you have this negative and this minus negative 1 on the outside, it doesn't matter what you put inside the parentheses. You can choose to put something, you can choose to just write this one. Now, to sketch this, remember every time you want to sketch a quadratic function, you start with the parent function, which is negative 2, 4. Negative 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, and 2, 4. This is the x and the y. And then you decide that you have to add a 2 to the x. So it's going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then you're going to multiply the y by 1/4 and then subtract 5. So you're going to multiply it by 1/4 and then add a 5. So it's going to be 1.25, 0.25, and 1. And then you're adding a 5 or subtracting a 5. It's going to be the same thing. You only do the opposite inside the parentheses. So subtracting 5 is going to be negative 4, negative 3.70 or 4.75. Then negative 5. Again, it's going to be negative 4.75. And then negative 4. So this is going to be your new x, and this is going to be your new y. Your points are 0, negative 4, 1, negative 4.75, 2, negative 5, 3, negative 4.75, and 4, negative 4. Once you graph it, you're going to see that it shifted 2 to the right, 5 down is going to be a narrower function. You can sketch it on the same over here with the parent function. Now let's move on to the next question. I'm gonna be doing this question down here. So let's look, they're asking you for g of 0. It means they have given you x equals 0 and you have to plug it in here. Let me write down the equation. 1/4 x minus 2 squared minus 5. They're asking for g of 0. It means plug in 0 for x. So 1/4, 0 minus 2 squared minus 5. Remember PEMDAS, you always have to start with the inside of the parentheses. So it's going to be 1/4, 0 minus 2 is going to be negative 2 squared minus 5. PEMDAS. After the p, there's the e, which is the exponent, so you have to get rid of the exponent. Negative 2 squared is going to be 4, so it's going to be 1/4, 4 minus 5. After exponent, there is multiplication, so by multiplying those, 4 is gone. 1 minus 5 is a negative 4, so g of 0 is negative 4. Let's write it up here. It's going to be negative 4. Now, g of x is equal to 11. It means the y is 11, and they want you to find x. So let's continue over here. They want g of x is equal to 11. It means y equals 11. What is x? Now, let's write down the equation. 1/4 x minus 2 squared minus 5 is equal to 11. Now, remember, when you solve, you have to isolate the x. So add 5 to both sides. You have 1/4 x minus 2 squared is equal to 16. Then you have to multiply the whole equation by 4 to get rid of this fraction. So you are left with x minus 2 squared is equal to 64. Now ask yourself, what can x minus 2 be for x minus 2 squared to be 64? So x minus 2 can either be an 8 or x minus 2 can be a negative 8. Because here it's going to be 8 squared equals to 64, or negative 8 squared is equal to 64. So solve for x. X can be either be 10 or x can be negative 6. So x can be either 10 or negative 6. Let's write it up there. So negative 6 or 10. X can be either negative 6 or 10. And remember they told you two values. So this is it for quadratic function. Let's start working on the square root. Write an equation of a function which reflects this parent function. over the x-axis. So if you want it to be reflected over the x-axis, then there should be a negative radical x. They said up to units, so nothing should be added on the inside, so you add a +2 outside. And the range of this one, to know the range, you can either sketch it or you can look at the vertex. It's 0, 2, and since it's reflected one, so it's going to be from negative infinity to the y of the vertex, so from negative infinity to 2. Now, to sketch this, also it's the same concept. You start with the current function. So it's going to be 0, 0, 1, 1, 4, 2, and 9, 3. Here you have to subtract a 3 from the x. And then you have to subtract 7 from the y. And then these two will be your new x and y, and this will help you sketch it. Now, they're asking for g of 1. To calculate g of 1 means you have to plug in 1 for x. So let's do that. As you can see, I did. So radical 1 plus 3 is radical 4 minus 7. Radical 4 is 2 minus 7, which is a negative 5. So g of 1 is negative 5. Now, if they tell you they want you to find g of x equals negative 3, it means that the y is negative 3. So let's do that. It means radical x plus 3 minus 7 is equal to negative 3. Again, to find x, you have to isolate the x, so add 7 to both sides. Radical x plus 3 is equal to 4. And then you square both sides to get rid of the radical, so x plus 3 is going to be 16. By subtracting 3 from both sides, you can see that x is 13. So x is 13. Now plug it in to make sure. 13 plus 3 is 16. Radical 16 is going to be 4 minus 7 is negative 3, so you are right. Now, these two are very important, where you have to write an equation telling you the vertex, telling you what the range is, and creating an equation, just like over here, and then telling you to find g of 0, and then to find what y could be, what x could be, again, what y could be, and what x can be. So review those very well. Now, for the third page, you should be able to sketch an absolute value function and a rational one. Remember, the rational is 1 over x, and the absolute is absolute value of x. Those are straightforward. Now, you're not responsible for exponential and logarithm. Let's talk about those. So if you want to describe the transformation, you look whether you're adding outside the parentheses or inside. If you're adding or subtracting outside, it means you're moving up or down. If you're adding or subtracting inside the parentheses, so you're moving sideways, right or left. If you're multiplying by number, it means you're stretching or compressing it. So let's talk about each one. This is going to be moving 1 down. This is 4 up. This is 3 to the left and 4 down. This is 1 to the right and 3 up. And the 2 means the graph is going to be vertically stretched. Now let's move on to the last page. Now again, let's talk about creating an equation. Now you have this function and they're asking you to move it 6 units to the right. So 6 units to the right means you have to subtract 6 from the inside of the radical. So x plus 2 minus 6, and the minus 1 stays outside. So it's going to be radical of x minus 4 and minus 1 on the outside. Move 7 units to the left, it means you have to add 7 on the inside. So x minus 4 plus 7 cubed plus 2. So it's going to be x plus 3 squared plus 2. Now, translating 3 units right, it means minus 3 on the inside or with the x. 2 units down, it means subtract 2 from the outside or whatever number is with that's not next to the x. So it's going to end up to be x minus 8 plus 4. So that's going to be your final equation. Now translate 3 units to the left, so add a 3 on the inside. 5 units up, it means add 5 on the outside. So it's going to be x plus 5 inside the absolute value and plus 2 on the outside. This is going to be your final equation. Review those very well. Now let's move on. creating a domain or range, asking for the domain and range from the figure. You can graph it if you want to, but basically you can just look at the vertex or the endpoint in this case and looking whether it's original, regular, or reflected. Now, since it's reflected, so the range is going to be from negative infinity to the y, and the domain is always from the x to plus infinity, x of the vertex to plus infinity. For the absolute value, also look at the vertex. Now the domain is always negative infinity to infinity, and the range, since it's plus, so it's going to be from the y of the vertex all the way to plus infinity. Since if you sketch it, it's going to look something like this, and this one, if you sketch, is going to be something like this. Now let's look at the last two questions. Domain, for this one, it means starting from left to right. So it's going to be -5 with a bracket and 6 with parentheses since it's an open circle. Range is from the middle or from the bottom to the top. So it's going to be -4 to 1, bracket on both sides since there's no open circle. Now the last question, domain from left to right. So it's going to be from -6 to 0, bracket on both ends. Now range from bottom to top, so -6 to 6. And there's no open circle, so that's why it's a bracket. So every time there's an open circle, you put parentheses, like here. Now, this is what the review is about. Review those questions very well. As for the questions that we didn't have time to do together, remember you can always look at the review. It's complete at the key, and I'm available Tuesday morning if you need any help.